He left the safe containing millions open to catch her red-handed. But what the poor housekeeper did changed him forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Harold Winters had not always been a man of silence. Once, in another life, when shipyards bore his name in brass plaques and men in Washington listened to his voice with real attention, he had spoken with thunder. But that life was long past, buried beneath decades of noise, loss, and betrayal. Now, at 78, silence was the only thing he trusted. Silence didn't lie. It didn't ask for his money. It didn't pretend to love him. And so, he lived in a house designed more for observation than for living, a fortress of red brick and white columns nestled behind wrought iron gates on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia. The house had 26 rooms, 16 security cameras, 3 panic buttons, and no visitors. The locals, when they mentioned him at all, spoke of him like a ghost. That old Navy man with the weird security gates, they said in town. The one who fired his last gardener for asking too many questions. But they didn't know the half of it. They hadn't watched their only son file a court motion to have them declared mentally incompetent just to get early access to a trust fund. They hadn't opened their accounts to find $100,000 missing, stolen by a daughter they'd once carried through measles and night terrors. They hadn't listened to a longtime doctor, a man who held their pulse in his palm for 2 decades, explain away years of inflated invoices with nothing but a shrug. Harold had endured it all and come to a singular conclusion. People were vultures in suits, or sometimes in scrubs. Once there had been warmth. Miriam, his wife of 47 years, had kept the house alive. She loved sunflowers in the foyer and the smell of fresh bread. Her absence was still a wound he didn't touch. Cancer had taken her in the same slow, unforgiving way it took his ability to hope. After her death, the grand Georgian house on the hill became a tomb, preserved in scentless polish and dim light. Harold didn't remodel. He didn't repaint. Everything stayed the same, except for the locks and the security system, which grew in number and complexity every year. By the time his grandchildren stopped calling, Harold had already installed 2-way speakers in the hallways and a backup generator in the basement. His last personal assistant, a soft-spoken man named Riley, had been caught pocketing silverware and blaming it on the dishwasher. The dishwasher didn't even speak English. It didn't matter. They were both gone the same week. The only thing Harold permitted to remain untouched was the library. It was Miriam's favorite room, floor-to-ceiling shelves of hardcover volumes, leather chairs softened by decades of reading, and a desk near the bay window where the morning sun made her white blonde hair glow like snow. He hadn't read a book in years, but he kept the spines dusted and the glass clean. He told himself it was for her. Most of Harold's days followed a strict pattern. Coffee at 6, oatmeal at 6:30, brief email scans by 7, and then an endless routine of silence punctuated by security monitor checks. The kitchen was stocked but rarely used. His meals were often brought in by a service he never met in person. The man who had once overseen international logistics now weighed apples for bruises and watched delivery drivers through tinted windows. But age was creeping in like moss on stone. His back stiffened more each morning. Simple tasks, emptying a bin, changing a filter, took more time than they should have. So, eventually, with great reluctance, Harold contacted a discreet placement agency in Atlanta that specialized in low-profile residential staff. He stipulated 3 conditions. The candidate must have no criminal record, no social media presence, and no interest in long conversations. The agency sent 3 options. 2 were dismissed without interviews. The third arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, a young woman named Jada Harris. She was not what Harold expected. In the file, she was described as punctual, detail-oriented, and motivated by purpose rather than profit. That last phrase had made him snort, but when she stepped onto his porch, wearing plain black flats and carrying a canvas tote instead of a handbag, he paused. Jada was 27, with deep brown skin and short, natural hair pulled back by a cloth band. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, no false smiles. Her expression was calm and alert, the kind of face that looked like it had listened more than it had spoken. He invited her in out of obligation, but found himself studying her closely. She moved like someone used to shared spaces, light on her feet, respectful of invisible boundaries. When he offered her a seat, she thanked him and sat upright, hands folded in her lap. She didn't ask about the salary. She didn't compliment the house. Instead, her first question was about the library. "Would you prefer I dust the shelves without shifting the books, or should I realign them by spine height?" Harold blinked. It was the most specific and relevant question he'd heard in years. "Don't move anything unless it's off-center," he said cautiously. She nodded once. "And do you have any allergies? Cleaning products, foods, pets?" He told her no. She made a small note in a worn notebook and waited. The interview lasted 17 minutes. He asked her about her background. She answered succinctly. She'd been born and raised in Atlanta, the daughter of a grocery store owner and a school bus driver. She was currently pursuing a master's degree in social work, attending classes online, and cleaning houses to pay her tuition. She lived in a shared apartment with 3 other women and sent money home each month. Harold didn't trust her. Not yet. But he found himself curious. She didn't try to flatter him. She didn't overshare. She didn't flinch when he mentioned security cameras. She simply asked when she could begin. He told her Wednesday. In truth, he already had a plan in motion. The last time he'd trusted someone, it cost him Miriam's engagement ring and 3 handwritten letters that had been in his desk drawer since Vietnam. That betrayal had come from a woman who'd once called him Uncle Harold and baked apple pie in his kitchen. Now, he needed to know who Jada was, not on paper, but when no one was watching. That evening, after she left, Harold sat at his desk and scribbled in his logbook. Jada Harris, clean speech, no eye contact dodging, wears flat shoes, possible candidate, test necessary. He flipped to a fresh page, outlined the parameters of his next move, and placed the notebook back into the drawer of his antique writing desk. Tomorrow she would return to begin work, and when she did, Harold would be waiting, not with words, but with silence, and a door left wide open. He slept that night with a strange mix of anticipation and dread coiled in his chest. For all his suspicion, there was a flicker of something else, something unspoken. He didn't dare name it, but it stirred beneath the weight of decades and whispered, "Maybe, not everyone, wants what you have." Jada Harris arrived precisely at 8 a.m. the following morning, as instructed. She wore the same kind of attire, simple, practical, devoid of anything that might be considered unnecessary. Her shoes, still the same black flats from the day before, made no sound on the polished floor as she stepped inside. Harold Winters greeted her with a short nod and an unreadable look, as if sizing up an opponent in a game where only one of them knew the rules. "Kitchen stocked. You'll find supplies under the sink. Start wherever you see fit," he said, already turning away. "I have an appointment this morning." Jada responded with a soft, "Yes, sir," and removed her coat, folding it neatly over her arm before setting it aside. Harold didn't linger to observe her reaction or movements. He had rehearsed this morning in his mind for hours the night before. Every variable, every moment, every temptation. The trap was already set. The room he referred to as the vault was not a conventional safe room, though it served a similar purpose. Behind a heavy walnut door at the end of the first-floor hallway, Harold kept not just money, but memory. Cash, yes, but also folders, titles, rare valuables that, for any other man, might be spread across deposit boxes and bank vaults. For Harold, there was a certain comfort in keeping everything close, in walking distance. He called it stewardship. Others might call it obsession. That morning, shortly before Jada arrived, Harold had gone into the room, turned off the alarm manually, opened the thick door, and rolled it just barely ajar. Inside, on a brushed steel table, he placed 4 leather-bound satchels, each filled with high-denomination bills. Stacks of $100 bills wrapped in bank bands. They were not casually arranged, but artfully, unmistakably visible. There was a small brass tray with his wife's antique brooches, inherited from her grandmother, sitting beside them. A few documents, property deeds and old passports, added to the sense of vulnerability, of exposure. He wanted it to look as if he had forgotten to secure it. Careless, trusting. Of course, Harold was anything but careless. He had retreated to his private study upstairs, where a panel of 8 monitors gave him access to every inch of the house. One monitor in particular now consumed his attention. The view into the hallway where the door to the vault remained half open, its interior partially lit by the overhead sconces. Jada had started in the foyer, dusting the baseboards with a soft-bristled brush. She moved without rush or hesitation, her face calm, her focus complete. As Harold watched, she pulled out a small cloth and began polishing the brass door handles one by one. She was thorough, intentional, no earbuds in her ears, no cell phone in her pocket. Her movements spoke of someone who found structure in repetition, pride in small rituals. He had seen others start this way too. Polite, professional, then curious. It was always the same progression. They'd finish one room and then idly meander down the hallway. A glance at the door, a tug at the knob, a peek. Some waited an hour, some less than 10 minutes. Eventually, the bait lured them in. Harold leaned back in his leather chair, folding his arms. The test had begun. Jada spent nearly an hour in the library. She removed each book, one at a time, wiped it down with a feathered duster, inspected the spine, and gently returned it to its place. Occasionally, she paused, running a finger across a title as if reading its texture. Miriam would have liked that, Harold thought absently. She always said books weren't just words, but objects with memory. After the library, Jada moved to the hallway. The camera above the entry caught the moment she noticed the door at the end. Her steps slowed, her head tilted slightly. Then she stopped. Harold held his breath. Jada took a step forward, then another, until she reached the doorway. She stood there for a moment, brow furrowed, peering inside. The camera caught her profile, the line of her cheekbone tense with thought. She reached out, but only to knock, gently, on the frame. No answer, of course. She didn't enter. Instead, she stepped back and took out her phone. Harold zoomed in on the screen. She was dialing. A few seconds passed, and then she spoke. "Miss Baker? Hi, it's Jada Harris. I just started this morning at Mr. Winter's residence. I'm sorry to bother you, but I think he may have forgotten to close a room that looks, well, important. There's cash in there, documents, jewelry, I think. Should I leave it as is, or—" Harold couldn't hear the other end of the conversation, but he knew what his secretary would say. He'd given her instructions the day before. Act casual, advise her to leave the room untouched, and assure her that Harold would handle it upon his return. Jada hung up. Then she stood still for several seconds, staring at the door. This was the moment that revealed everything. What would she do, now that she knew no one else would be coming? That the room would remain unsecured for hours. Harold's fingers hovered over the pause button, unable to look away. Jada turned and left, but not for good. She returned moments later with a wooden chair from the breakfast nook. Placing it across from the open door, she sat down, hands folded in her lap, eyes steady, silent sentinel. Harold stared at the monitor. He hadn't written a protocol for this. For the next 20 minutes, Jada sat unmoving. At one point, she pulled out a paperback novel from her tote and began reading quietly, never shifting her position in a way that would expose her back to the hallway. Her eyes darted up at every creak of the old wood, every rattle of wind. An hour passed, then 2. Once, she stood and dusted a side table nearby. Another time, she disappeared into the kitchen and returned minutes later with a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. She ate it, sitting on the same chair opposite the vault. When a delivery truck rang the bell at the gate, she activated the intercom but declined the package. "Mr. Winters isn't available today. Please come back tomorrow," she said politely but firmly. She never moved more than a room away. Harold was riveted. At one point he forgot to sip his coffee, and it went cold beside him. Then came the phone call. Jada answered her phone mid-afternoon, stepping away from the door only a few feet. She lowered her voice, but the camera's mic caught fragments. "No, Mama, don't cry. I'm trying. I know what it means if they close the shop. Yeah, 38. I don't know where we're going to find it, but..." A long pause. "I'll figure it out." Silence. Her back straightened. Her hand trembled as she tucked the phone into her bag. She turned toward the hallway, her gaze drifting to the vault door. Harold sat forward. His heart pounded. This was it. But what happened next undid everything he thought he understood. Jada stood, walked deliberately toward the open door, and entered the room. She looked around once, just long enough to find the security keypad, then typed in a code. Any code, Harold assumed. When the red light blinked, she used the manual lock instead, sliding the steel bolt into place. Then she took the small slip of paper with the correct combination, still resting by the edge of the door, and folded it into a square before slipping it into her back pocket. She walked out, closed the door gently behind her, and returned to her chair. And cried. Harold didn't move for a long time. He watched her shoulders shake, her hands clench the fabric of her pants. She wasn't loud, she didn't pace. She simply sat there, facing the closed door, grieving something far heavier than the day itself. She had every reason. The problem she carried wasn't small. It was real. $38,000 was more than enough to crush a family business, and she had been alone in a house with over $4 million in cash. All she would have needed was a single stack. No one would know, but she didn't. She chose not to. Not even temptation, not even desperation had cracked her. For Harold Winters, it was not just an anomaly, it was a revelation. He sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, at the faint texture of old plaster. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel quite so certain about the ugliness of people. Somewhere downstairs, a young woman guarded a vault that wasn't hers. And for reasons he still didn't understand, she believed that what was right was more important than what was possible. When Harold finally rose from the chair in his study, it was nearing dusk. The house had begun to shift with the subtle groans of evening. timbers creaking in their old sockets, air ducts exhaling softly like the breath of something asleep. Yet, downstairs, Jaida remained in her seat outside the now locked vault, her silhouette framed in the pale wash of light from the hallway sconces. She hadn't moved since closing the door. From the monitors, Harold could still see the crumpled tissue in her hand and the shimmer of tears drying on her cheeks. He stood slowly, his knees stiff with age and stillness, and crossed the room to the closet. From inside, he pulled a charcoal coat, brushed the lint from the sleeves, and slipped it on. Then, before descending, he paused at the mirror by the door. His reflection looked older than he remembered, more bent, more hollow. There was a weight on his chest that had nothing to do with age or lungs. It was something else, something that felt suspiciously like shame. In the foyer, he made deliberate noise, keys jangling, a purposeful clearing of his throat, the creak of the front door opening just a few inches and closing again. He wanted her to believe he had returned from wherever he was supposed to have gone. From downstairs, he heard movement, light footsteps, the scrape of a chair being pushed back. Jaida appeared a moment later, her eyes still red but her posture collected. She didn't fumble or apologize right away. Instead, she took a deep breath, tucked a stray curl behind her ear, and faced him with something close to resolve. "Mr. Winters," she said, her voice tight but respectful, "I hope you don't mind. I noticed the door to that room was open when I passed by this morning. I thought maybe it was a mistake." Harold didn't answer immediately. He studied her careful tone, the measured way she held herself together like someone patching a dam already cracked. His silence stretched just long enough to make her shift slightly. "I called your assistant," she added. "She said not to touch anything, so I didn't, but She hesitated. "I didn't want to leave it unattended, so I stayed." He nodded, slowly. "I saw." Jaida blinked. "You saw?" Harold gestured toward the ceiling. "There are cameras in every room, even that one." There was a brief flicker in her eyes, something like embarrassment or perhaps unease. But she didn't react with outrage or disbelief. She merely looked away for a moment and then back. "I understand," she said quietly. "It's your house." A pause fell between them like dust settling after motion. Then Harold asked, more softly than he'd intended, "Is everything all right, Miss Harris? You seemed upset earlier." Jaida looked down, her lips pressed together for a moment before she exhaled slowly. "I wasn't going to say anything," she murmured. "It's not your problem." "Perhaps not, but you've spent the last several hours guarding my money without being asked to. That earns you at least a question or two." That almost drew a smile. Almost. But instead, Jaida looked up, eyes shining again, and said, "It's my mother. And the store. They've been trying to keep it going for years. But a new grocery chain just opened down the street. Everything cheaper, flashier. We lost half our customers in a month. Now the bank's threatening to close us down unless we pay the debt. $38,000. She said it like it was a death sentence, not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet, flat number that contained within it the slow collapse of her family's world. "I work 2 jobs," she continued. "I send money home every month. I'm in school full-time. I live with 3 roommates in an apartment that smells like bleach and old pipe smoke. And it's still not enough, I thought." She stopped herself, shook her head. "Doesn't matter what I thought. There's nothing I can do." Harold listened without interrupting. He had heard sob stories before, some real, some constructed for maximum sympathy. but there was nothing rehearsed in her voice. No flourish, no angle. She wasn't asking him for anything. She hadn't even intended to tell him. That, more than the details, gave her words weight. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small envelope. Crisp, sealed. It had been prepared the day before. "I was going to give this to you at the end of the week," he said, "but now seems appropriate." Jada looked at the envelope in his hand, then slowly extended hers to take it. She opened it carefully. Inside was a thick band of cash, $50,000. Her hands froze. Her face didn't change right away. It was as if her brain refused to compute what her eyes were seeing. "I can't take this," she said finally, almost in a whisper. "You can," Harold said. "You earned it." "I didn't." She shook her head. "I didn't do anything. I didn't clean the bedrooms. I didn't finish the kitchen." "You passed the test." That made her pause. "Test?" Harold nodded. "I left the vault open on purpose. I do it for all my hires. I want to see who they really are when they think no one's watching. Most fail. Some instantly. Some wait a day. But they all go in eventually. They all touch something. Some take a little, thinking it won't be noticed. Others just stare too long, run their fingers over the bills like it belongs to them. But you didn't. You did the opposite." Jada stared at the envelope, then closed it. "That doesn't mean I deserve this. It means you deserve more than you think." Still, she didn't pocket it. She held it like a live bird, afraid that too tight a grip might crush it. "I didn't even think about it," she said after a long pause. "That room, I knew what it was, and I knew I shouldn't go in. Not because of fear, but because it wouldn't be right." Harold felt a tightness in his throat. She said it so plainly, so simply. "I had a job to do," Jada went on, "to take care of your home. That meant protecting it, even if you didn't ask. That's not special. That's just being decent. That," Harold said, "is rarer than you think." She didn't respond. She simply looked down again, the envelope still untouched in her hands. "I'm not trying to buy you," he added. "I'm trying to thank you." Jada swallowed hard, her voice catching when she finally said, "You already helped my family once. You didn't even know it." Harold frowned. "I don't follow." She reached into her canvas tote and pulled out a folded clipping from a newspaper. The edges were soft with age, the ink faded. "It's from 3 years ago. An article about anonymous donations made to Grady Memorial Hospital. It said the donor covered surgeries for over a dozen patients. No name, just a gesture." Harold remembered. It had been a quiet gesture, something done without press or photo ops. A nurse had insisted on submitting a press release, and the hospital's PR team had obliged, but he had declined all credit. "My cousin Paco," Jada said, her voice trembling, "was one of those patients. He was 8, born with a heart defect. The operation he needed wasn't covered by our insurance. My uncle couldn't afford it. Then one day, out of nowhere, the hospital said a private donor had paid the full amount. It saved his life. We never knew who did it. Not until I saw your name, months later, mentioned in a hospital donor registry, I connected the dots." She looked up. "I didn't come here to work for money. I asked the agency to find me a job in this neighborhood. I wanted to see who you were, the person who saved my cousin. I just wanted to say thank you in person someday." Harold stood frozen. No one had ever said that to him, not once, not in all his years of giving. It had always been transactions, investments, tax deductions, or cold thanks and letters written by assistants. But this was something entirely different. This was gratitude rooted not in entitlement, but in awe, and something closer to reverence. Jada took a deep breath. "So, you see, Mr. Winters, you've already done more for me than I could ever repay. I can't take this money. It doesn't belong to me. It never did." Harold wanted to argue. He wanted to insist, but something in her eyes stopped him. There was conviction there. Not pride, just principle. And that was harder to resist than any pleading. He nodded slowly. "You remind me," he said, "of someone I used to believe in." She didn't ask who. He was grateful for that. They stood for a moment in silence. Then Jada looked at the envelope again and asked, "Can I at least use some of it for the store? Just enough to hold things together?" Harold exhaled through his nose and said, "We'll figure something out." She smiled for the first time that day. It was small, tired, but real. That night, after she left, Harold remained in the hallway for a long while, standing by the closed door of the vault. He didn't check the cameras. He didn't call his secretary. He simply stared at the door, remembering the quiet way she'd sat in front of it, guarding something that had never been hers. And somewhere inside that thick, weathered shell he called a heart, a sliver of light slipped through. Harold awoke the next morning earlier than usual, though sleep had never truly claimed him. His bed had become a place of thought, not rest, and through the night he had stared at the shadows on the ceiling, listening to the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway below. Something in him had shifted. He didn't need a mirror to see it. He felt it in his breath, in the way he lingered over his coffee longer than he had in years, and how he didn't immediately turn on the bank of monitors. For the first time in recent memory, he wasn't concerned about what the cameras would reveal. Jada arrived as usual, 15 minutes early, wearing the same quiet expression she always did. There was a tension in her posture, though, as if part of her regretted saying too much the day before. She moved through the kitchen, gathering supplies, and made a note in her small notebook about needing more vinegar for the glass panels. Harold watched from the hallway for a moment before stepping forward. "Come with me," he said simply. Jada looked up, startled. "Sir?" "To the study," he added. "There's something I want to show you." She followed him in silence, her steps careful. The study was a room she hadn't entered before, book-lined like the library but with darker walls and fewer windows. At the far end stood the desk where Harold had written hundreds of letters, signed millions in contracts, and, more recently, compiled the pages of a future he had assumed no one would ever care to inherit. He opened a drawer and removed a slim black folder. It was thick, and its contents were organized with the precision of someone who needed order to function. Jada waited by the door, unsure whether to sit or stand. Harold gestured to a chair. "This is my foundation," he said. "The Harold Winters Charitable Trust, registered 2 decades ago, funded through a complex maze of investments and holding companies. On paper, it looks like a passive structure, but it's not. I oversee every grant, every partner, every distribution." Jada nodded, her hands folded in her lap. "I created it after Miriam died," Harold continued. "She always said money was meant to be used, not hoarded. I didn't believe her until she was gone. Since then, I've funded hundreds of programs, most anonymously. Hospitals, clinics, scholarships, rehabilitation programs for veterans. But the thing is, I never trusted anyone else to run it. I didn't want it corrupted." He paused, watching her absorb the words. She didn't ask questions, only listened. "I tried," he said after a moment. "I gave tests, like the one I gave you, to people who'd worked for me for years. No one passed. Some were good liars. Others just didn't think anyone would notice. You're the first one who didn't fail. Jada's voice was soft when she finally spoke. You think a person is only honest if they resist temptation. No, Harold said, but I think character shows itself when there's no reward for doing the right thing. You didn't just resist the money. You protected it. Then you gave it back. I didn't do it for you, she said, her voice steady. I did it because it would have been wrong. Exactly. He opened the folder and slid it across the desk. Inside were legal documents, contracts, letters of appointment. Her name had already been typed in the appropriate places. Jada stared at it. What is this? My new will, Harold said. You're the primary heir. Not to the house, not to the car, to the foundation. You'll run it. You'll decide where the money goes, how it's spent, who gets helped. She blinked. I don't know anything about running a foundation. You'll learn. I'm just a student. You're more than that. I work part-time cleaning houses. Harold leaned forward, which means you know what need looks like. You know what $100 can mean to someone who has nothing. That's more important than anything a business school could teach you. Jada looked down at the folder again. Her fingers brushed the edge of the paper, but she didn't touch it. I don't think I can accept this, she said finally. It's too much. Harold nodded slowly. I thought you'd say that, which is why I want to explain something. He rose and walked to a small safe behind a painting. He opened it with a quiet series of clicks and returned with another envelope, thicker than the last. He placed it on the table between them but didn't open it. 3 years ago, he said, after I read the hospital reports on the children we helped, I started looking into the families. Quietly, discreetly. I wasn't supposed to. It was a breach of the agreement, but I needed to know if the money made a difference. Jada tilted her head slightly, uncertain where he was going. One of the nurses dropped a list. I saw your name. I saw your cousins. I remembered. Her eyes widened. You knew? I knew you were connected. I didn't know it was you when you applied, but when I saw the file, I recognized the last name. So I ran a background check, not just for employment. I hired a private investigator. Jada's mouth opened slightly. You what? For a week, Harold said. Nothing invasive, just observation. I needed to know if what I saw on paper was real. The report said you gave your lunch to another student, that you helped your landlord's mother get groceries, that you once gave a friend money to pay for a cancer screening instead of saving it for tuition. Jada flushed. That wasn't for anyone to know. I know, Harold said quietly, and I'm sorry, but I needed to be sure. I've spent too many years surrounded by people who say the right things and do the wrong ones. I couldn't risk putting something this important in the wrong hands. There was silence between them again. Then Jada said, So the test wasn't just about the vault. Harold shook his head. It was the final piece, the confirmation. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply. You've been watching me since before I set foot in this house. I was looking for someone worth trusting. And you decided that person was me. I'm certain of it. Jada looked away toward the bookshelf behind him. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. Why now? She asked. Why decide this now? Harold hesitated. Then he said, Because I'm running out of time. She turned sharply. I'm not dying, he clarified. Not in the immediate sense. But I'm 78. I've seen what happens when these things are left to chance. I need to put things in place while I still can, while I can teach you. Jada shook her head. But you don't even know if I want this. Do you? She was quiet for a long moment. I think I want to help, she said slowly. I always have. That's why I chose social work. That's why I'm still working and studying and sending money home even when I'm exhausted. I just never imagined anything like this. This is huge. Harold smiled faintly. Yes, it is. Jada looked back at the folder. Her fingers brushed the cover again. What if I fail? Then you fail, and someone else picks up the pieces. But I don't think you will. She took a breath, then another, then nodded. I'll do it, she said, but not for the money, not for the title. I'll do it because I think there are people who need this, like Paco, like me. Harold extended a hand. Jada hesitated for only a second before taking it. It wasn't the firm handshake of a contract. It was the quiet clasp of trust, earned and given. They sat together in silence for a few more minutes. Outside, the early light of day grew brighter, casting long lines across the wood floor. Jada's phone buzzed, a text from her mother. She looked at it, smiled, then tucked it away. I won't tell them where the help came from, she said. They don't need to know, just that it's going to be okay. Harold nodded. You've got a lot to learn, he said. I know. And I'm not always easy. I figured. But if you mean what you say, I'll teach you everything I know. Jada met his eyes. I do. That night, Harold didn't turn on the cameras. He didn't check the locks twice. He didn't write in the logbook. Instead, he made 2 cups of tea, brought one to the study, and left it on the desk next to the folder. Then he sat by the window, watching the horizon, and allowed himself, for the first time in years, to believe that someone would carry the torch, and that perhaps, just perhaps, he wouldn't have to walk the final stretch of his journey alone. 6 months passed like seasons behind drawn curtains, quietly, with barely perceptible shifts that nonetheless changed everything. The Winters house, once a mausoleum of suspicion and polished stillness, began to pulse with a kind of muted rhythm. It wasn't noisy or dramatic. It was small things. A second mug left to dry beside the sink. A new notepad on the desk in Harold's study. The faint scent of roasted coffee where instant grounds used to sit untouched. A single photograph in a silver frame on the library shelf. Jada and Harold standing beside the front steps, neither smiling, but both looking resolute, as if bearing witness to a pact made without fanfare. Jada had not moved into the house. She insisted on continuing her life as it had been, sharing an apartment with 2 other graduate students, waking at 5 to study before taking the bus to the Foundation's new office downtown. She refused Harold's offer of a driver. I like the ride, she told him once. It keeps me grounded. He didn't press. The Harold Winters Charitable Trust now operated out of a modest brick building on Oglethorpe Avenue. Nothing flashy. Nothing that would draw attention. Just 3 rooms. An office for Jada, a shared workspace for the interns Harold insisted she hire. Surround yourself with young minds, he'd said. And a small conference room lined with whiteboards and donation reports. The plaque on the door read only Winters Foundation. Beneath it, in smaller script, were words Harold had asked Jada to choose. She had written, simply, hope, dignity, repair. The foundation had changed, though its mission had not. Under Jada's leadership, it launched 3 new programs in its first quarter: a scholarship fund for BIPOC students in public universities across Georgia, a micro-loan initiative for struggling family-owned stores in rural towns, and a housing stability fund for single mothers facing eviction. Each program was structured with fierce attention to detail and a requirement that every dollar be accounted for. Jada, to no one's surprise, tracked every figure herself. Harold remained involved, though more as a mentor than a manager. Each morning he would arrive at the office with a stack of manila folders under his arm and a thermos of black coffee. He'd sit across from Jada at the small table in her office and ask, "So, who are we helping today?" Their mornings were spent reviewing proposals, grant requests, emergency appeals. Their afternoons, more often than not, slipped into conversation: philosophy, history, economics, memory. Harold talked more than he used to. Jada listened more than most people ever had. She learned about his years in the Navy, about the first boat he built with his father, about the night he met Miriam at a theater production of Hamlet, and how she had refused to marry him unless he read every one of Shakespeare's plays. He told her about the early days of his business, when he'd slept in his office and eaten canned beans, and once wired his last savings into a broken-down factory in Jacksonville, betting on a handshake. He told her about the cost of success, about what money gave and what it took. Jada, in turn, told him about her mother, a woman who had never graduated high school but could run inventory in her head and tell you the price of every box of cereal from memory. She told him about Paco, who was now playing junior league baseball and wanted to be a cardiologist. She told him about the days when she hadn't eaten so her sister could have lunch, about sleeping with her coat on because the heat had gone out in winter, about how fear never really left you once you'd lived with it long enough. It was not a friendship in the traditional sense. It was something older, sturdier, a kind of recognition. Like two travelers who meet late in their separate journeys and realize they'd been walking parallel paths all along. At the end of each week, Jada returned home with a different expression. Tired, yes, but settled, like someone who had found a rhythm, a reason. Her roommates noticed the change. Her professors noticed it too. Her work was sharper, her participation deeper. When she finally submitted her capstone paper on restorative justice and community-based philanthropy, the faculty chair wrote in the margin, "This isn't just theory. You're living it." Back at home, her mother's store was thriving. Not because of a large donation. Jada had insisted on structuring it through the foundation's small business program, with oversight and conditions like every other recipient. Her mother never asked who had approved it. She just cried when the bank called to say the loan had been renegotiated and the foreclosure withdrawn. Jada never told her. Harold had agreed. Anonymous gifts, he said, carry more dignity than checks with names on them. Sometimes Harold would watch Jada from the corner of the conference room, surrounded by spreadsheets and maps of communities he had never set foot in, and wonder how he had nearly let all of this possibility, this continuation, slip through his fingers. He had spent years building fences against the world, and, in the end, it had taken one young woman with a borrowed coat and a steady gaze to prove that the gates should have been open all along. One afternoon in early spring, they sat together on the porch of the Winters house, looking out at the cypress trees stirring in the wind. The sky was the color of polished glass, and a single hawk circled high overhead. Jada had just finished presenting her latest proposal, a satellite version of the foundation in Birmingham, led by one of the scholarship recipients she had personally mentored. Harold had approved it without hesitation. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think legacy was about what you leave behind. Buildings, companies, a name carved in stone." Jada didn't speak. She knew enough by now to wait. But maybe it's about who you trust to carry the story forward, someone who will add to it, not just repeat it. She turned toward him. You think I'm ready for that? You were ready the day you sat outside that vault for 6 hours without touching a thing. Jada smiled. I didn't feel ready. Neither did I when I started, he said. That's how you know it's real. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. The breeze lifted the collar of his shirt, and a bird called once from the trees. I had a daughter once, he said after a while. She stopped talking to me when I refused to sell the company early. She thought I owed her a comfortable life. I thought I owed her something harder. We never found the middle. Jada listened without judgment. You're not her, he added, but you've given me the thing I thought I'd never have again. What's that? Peace. That evening, Harold stayed in the library after Jada left, flipping through old folders. He paused on a photograph of Miriam, standing beside a box of books in the original Foundation office in Atlanta. She was smiling at the camera, her hair tucked behind one ear, holding a clipboard like it was a compass. I found her, he said aloud, though the room was empty. I found someone who understands. In the coming weeks, Jada would begin training 2 new hires. She would write her first keynote address for a conference in D.C., help launch an emergency rental assistance program in Louisiana, and appear in a regional news segment she hadn't agreed to, but handled with poise. She would become the face of something she never asked to lead, and she would carry it with the humility of someone who understood what it meant to have nothing. But for now, on that porch in Georgia, she sat beside an old man who no longer watched the world through glass. And they said nothing at all because nothing more needed to be said. The air was still on the morning Harold finally told her. The early spring sunlight slid through the curtains in golden shafts, illuminating dust motes that hovered gently in the quiet of the winter's house. Jada arrived that day as she always did, with a binder under one arm and her worn canvas tote over the other, the faint smell of bergamot tea clinging to her sweater. She found Harold already awake, sitting at the breakfast table with a pot of coffee that had long since gone cold. He looked different somehow, not weaker, but reflective. He didn't speak when she entered, only gestured for her to sit. She obeyed, instinctively understanding that whatever conversation waited would not be of the usual kind. Her instinct was rarely wrong now. Time at the Foundation had taught her how to read silences, how to sense the weight in people's pauses, how to listen beneath the surface of what was said. Harold poured her coffee without asking. It was cold, but she didn't protest. She waited. I have something to tell you, he said finally, his voice rough around the edges, like an old vinyl worn by repetition. Something I should have said months ago. Jada set her binder aside. I knew about you before you ever rang my doorbell, he said. Long before. She didn't interrupt. I told you the test with the vault was my first glimpse of who you were. That was a lie, or at least a convenient omission. I had already seen enough. I had you followed, investigated. Jada blinked, not from shock, but from a quiet sense of recognition. It wasn't that she had expected this, not exactly, but in retrospect it felt inevitable. Harold had always been a man of caution. It was only for a week, he continued, not defensive, only explanatory. Enough time to see how you treated the woman in the wheelchair who lived downstairs from you, how you split your sandwich in half when your roommate had overdrafted her account again, how you bought medicine for a classmate when you didn't have money for your own groceries. Jada folded her hands on the table. Her voice, when it came, was calm. Why are you telling me this now? Harold looked out the window. The trees outside had begun to bloom, pale green buds clinging to the branches like whispers of something not quite born. Because I want you to understand that what I saw in you wasn't an accident. It wasn't just a moment of goodness captured by a camera. You've been this person all along, and I need you to carry something forward." Jada tilted her head. "You already gave me the foundation." He shook his head. "That was a beginning, not the whole picture." He stood then, slowly, with the stiffness that age demands, and moved to the cabinet near the hallway. From within, he pulled a leather portfolio, well-worn and thick with pages. He returned to the table, opened it, and pushed it toward her. Inside were hand-drawn diagrams, typed outlines, letters of intent, and rough mission statements. Across the top of the first page, in block letters, were the words, "Network of Hope." "I've been sitting on this idea for years," Harold said. "The foundation was always meant to be more than a single stream. I wanted to build a web, a network of people like you, working in their own communities, guiding resources to where they were most needed, not from behind desks, but from the sidewalks, the schools, the shelters." Jada slowly flipped through the pages. Diagrams showed regional branches, mentorship models, evaluation metrics, and profiles of community organizers he had once considered but never pursued. Some of the names were crossed out in red ink, others circled. Most had question marks. "I wanted to do it myself," Harold continued, "but the older I got, the more I realized I didn't have the energy for that scale. I could build ships, I could manage fleets, but I couldn't run this alone, and I never found the right captain." He looked at her then, eyes clear. "Until you." Jada closed the folder slowly and let her hands rest on it. "You want me to build this?" she said, not as a question. "I want you to lead it," he replied. "I'll guide you. I'll give you the structure, the money, the legal teeth to make it real. But you will breathe life into it. You will decide who joins. You will shape the voice." She said nothing for a long time. Then she nodded once. "When do we start?" Harold smiled. "We already have." In the weeks that followed, the foundation's routine transformed. What had once been a 3-person operation in a modest office began to expand. New interns, regional coordinators, a rotating board of community advocates Jada selected herself. Each candidate was evaluated not by pedigree, but by lived commitment. Harold's rule was simple. No one who applied would be judged by the language of grant writing, only by what they had already done for others without applause. They called the new initiative the Hope Network. It began with pilot programs in Birmingham, Memphis, and Wilmington, cities where Jada had contacts from school or past volunteer work. Each regional hub received a modest fund, but more importantly, they received mentorship. Jada insisted that every new coordinator spend a week shadowing her team before taking the reins. Stories poured in of school lunch programs revived, of domestic abuse shelters given a second life, of high school students given laptops and tutors. The press caught wind of it, and though Harold recoiled at the attention, Jada handled it with grace, never revealing the depth of the operation or her personal connection to its origin. One reporter asked her during an interview, "What inspired you to lead a network like this?" She had smiled just faintly. "Someone once believed in me more than I believed in myself. This is how I repay that." At home, Harold watched the interview from the library, his old reading glasses perched on his nose. He said nothing, but when Jada returned later that evening, she found a bouquet of sunflowers on her desk, the only kind of flower Miriam had ever kept in the house. By the end of that spring, the foundation had launched programs in 10 states. Jada had begun giving lectures at universities, not as a professional speaker, but as a practitioner. She insisted on sharing the stage with the people whose lives had been changed, who now worked as field leaders. She refused to call herself the founder of the network, always redirecting credit to community vision and collaborative compassion. But those close to the heart of the work knew. She was its engine, its gravity. Harold, for his part, began to fade from the public side of the operation. He still came to the office, but only to sit by the window and read proposals or to write personal notes to grantees. His body slowed, but his mind remained sharp, his memory crystalline when it came to the names of donors, the history of programs, the scars of past mistakes. One afternoon, while reviewing a proposal from Detroit, he looked across the desk and said, "Do you know what I see when I look at you now?" Jada looked up from her laptop. "I see the daughter I always wanted," he said. "Not someone who shares my blood, someone who shares my burden." Jada didn't reply right away, but when she did, her voice was low. "I see the father I didn't think I'd ever have." That evening, they dined on the back terrace overlooking the hills, the city lights beginning to flicker like lanterns in the distance. Harold lifted a glass of water, not wine, not bourbon, and made a toast to the ones we choose and the futures we build with them. Jada clinked her glass softly to his. The air smelled of grass and honeysuckle. Somewhere, far off, a dog barked once, then fell silent. They sat together long after the plates were cleared, the sky deepening into velvet above them. For the first time, Harold didn't feel the need to check the door locks, didn't glance toward the security panel, didn't imagine shadows hiding intentions. His world, once fortified by suspicion, now stood open. Not because he had been wrong to guard it, but because someone had finally proved worthy of walking inside. Jada leaned her head back, eyes closed, a breeze moving through her curls. Harold studied her face, not the girl who had once swept his floor, or the student who had once asked about bookshelves, but the woman who had taken the pieces of his guarded legacy and turned them into bridges. And in that quiet, something settled between them. Not an ending, not even a resolution. Just the understanding that what had begun with a test in a silent house had become a living, breathing testament to trust. The network of hope had begun not with blueprints or funding, but with a single act of restraint and an old man's decision to open a door. And in that choice, in that moment, they had rewritten the future, not just for themselves, but for everyone they were now helping to stand. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more. Watch our next videos to discover stories that inspire change. And please, share this video with someone who still believes in trust and kindness.